Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation, Caroline, and also for this introduction. And also thanks to the team for organizing this conference. Unfortunately, as you will hear, I will be speaking in English because my French is not good enough to present. It would take a very long time. So I prefer to speak in English. Just to start off, I first will just address the first theme of our seminar, the digital heritage, and then discuss in brief the Golden Agents project as an example of the way we are dealing with digital methods and tools in the context of heritage. So this is the Golden Agents project, and it's about the Dutch Golden Age. And there were many databases of Dutch Golden Age already about literature or the visual arts or music or poetry, but they were all silos and they were not corresponding with each other. So we wanted to bring those various data sets together in an infrastructure and in a project called Creative Industries and the Making of the Dutch Golden Age. So the aim was, first of all, to get a grip on the interactions between the various branches of the creative industries of the Dutch Golden Age. And also we wanted to have more understanding about the relations between production and consumption of creative goods of Amsterdam and the Dutch Golden Age. There were a lot of databases about productions, but less about consumers. And for that reason, we wanted to get a grip on all layers of society of Amsterdam by looking into probate inventories of what people were possessing in the houses. This is not a research project, it's an infrastructure project. Which was created together by cultural heritage institutions like the Rijksmuseum, the Dutch National Library, the Netherlands Institute for the History of Art, but also some universities in the Netherlands. So a collaboration between research institutions and cultural heritage institutions. So the end, I show you just the end result. This is the website of the Dutch Golden Agents project. It is, as I said, an infrastructure project. So it's not about research, but you see above that we have access to data sets, to ontologies, to tools, and then some short information about the project itself as well. I have a link here if you want to play with it. I also sent a PDF of my presentation to Caroline so that you later can also get the information if you want to work with this. What was the Golden Ages infrastructure? Now, first of all, it is a combination of semantic web and multi-agent technologies with the idea to analyze the interactions between existing data sets, but also new data sets of linked data of the Dutch Golden Age. As I said, we wanted to have information about what people were having in the houses in Amsterdam. And therefore, we had a combination of handwritten text recognition and crowdsourcing to disclose 2.5 million scans of notary acts of the city of Amsterdam of the 17th century. And finally, we developed tools to support researchers in all stages of data handling, but also to give them insight into the incompleteness and uncertainties in data so that they are actually know what they're doing when they are playing with our data sets. So we created a pipeline. I just showed this, a pipeline from the information of what sits in the probate invitation. So we made a scans of all those 2.5 million scans of probate inventories. And you see inventory lists of all sorts of objects that people are having in the houses, which we then are able to connect via linked data to, for instance, if a painting is mentioned, to a painting which sits in the database of the Netherlands Institute for the History of Art. So here, for instance, you have a line that says something about a painting by a Samaritan, the Good Samaritan, a biblical story. Then, of course, you do not know exactly which painting that it is. In that case, we just linked to the icon class number so that at least the people can see all the different paintings of the Good Samaritan. But sometimes we had the full title and then we could show the individual work of art. If you make such a pipeline, then you will have, and of different institutions, then of course you have a lot of uncertainties. And what we found important was to demonstrate that every time that if you are dealing with data sets, and every step that you're taking in that pipeline, the data is changing. And that means also that you need to support the user of your data set throughout the whole process. And if you leave it in the hands of the computer scientists, then they will do it for you. So we want to invite the people to work with this data, but then of course you also need to provide them with the tools so that they can do so. And to give an example of this, this is a tool called lenticular lenses. This is a tool in which the users, for instance, can do a disambiguation of person names. If you get a lot of names from the archives of people, then you still do not know which people these are. And in particular, if you have a very common name, like John Smith, for instance, then you will have many John Smiths. So how do you know which one you're looking for? Now, that's always very difficult, but at least during your life, you go a couple of times to a notary. For instance, when there's a birth act, or when you are going to marry, or you have a prenuptial agreement, or you have a business contract with someone. In all those different stages, you very often have testimonies. And in that case, you can combine the names of the people who were present at that particular moment at the notary, combine with all those names. And the likelihood that you have the same people over time recurring gives you the possibilities to create little networks, and then to say, okay, it's more likely that in this network this person is functioning, and so it is probably this John Smith and not another John Smith. So this was a kind of example that we gave to the users to create their own networks, to make and to enable them to identify people in the documents that they were finding. As I said, we also create several ontologies to enable the computer to reason over this. First of all, we created a very generic ontology for the Golden Agents project itself, based on storylines. Also in museums and in cultural heritage institutions, you are telling multiple stories about your own collections. And that's what was something that we took as a departure for modeling the data in our data project. Secondly, if you are going to use multiple collections, very heterogeneous collections, then you need to know where your information is coming from. In particular, when using archival sources, you have a lot of uncertainties. And therefore, we found it very important to create a separate ontology to get a grip on provenance and uncertainties in archival data. So I will discuss that as well. And finally, we set up a couple of experiments, although we were not really allowed to do research because we were building an infrastructure with specific ontologies for the history of art, and in particular for time, because we were not completely satisfied with existing ontologies dealing with historical processes. So we created 3 different sort of ontologies, which I will discuss briefly. First of all, we used for the storylines the ontologies for storylines. We used Rembrandt as an example. Although we were not just interested in the elite art and elitist art, we wanted to have Rembrandt and the Night Watch, because that allowed us to to work with very many different sort of perspectives on the Night Watch, so that we were sure that we had a lot of information for our ontological model. Now, you can tell a material story about the Night Watch. For instance, the Night Watch has been damaged a couple of times, but it has been cut up to place it in the town hall of Amsterdam. And the left-hand side below, you see a drawing of a certain Ludens, who made a drawing after the original night watch when it wasn't cut yet. And that, for instance, was used to make, at the right-hand side below, a digital reconstruction of the original painting of the night watch. So in this way, you can tell a material story about the history of a material history of the night watch. But we were also interested in what George Coupler, for instance, has called differences between prime objects and replicas. So there have been made many, many different sort of copies of the night watch. And sometimes they are static, like statues, but sometimes these are theater companies who are reenacting the night watch. And we also here have, for instance, a tattoo on the back of Mr. Beck of the night watch, who for the first time went to the Rijksmuseum to compare his own, of the tattooist went with him to compare his own work of art with the original night watch. And that's also interesting when you need to model time, because this tattoo wasn't finished yet. And he also wanted not to add the faces of the people in the painting of Rembrandt, but he put his own family portraits in the tattoo. So you have here different sort of times actually captured in that tattoo, which you need to model. So this was the kind of things that we were working with to get a grip on the concept of time in relation to the night watch. That's what we modeled. So here's an example of how we modeled the history of the night watch. Now, for instance, you have the night watch, if you have still existing works, which can, if you now make a cut in time, then you can see all the works of Rembrandt which are still existing. But we also have examples of paintings, for instance, that existed in the past, but don't exist anymore, or we do not know it anymore. For instance, stolen works of Rembrandt in the museum in Boston in the past, or for instance, references to works in archival documents, like the work The Silence of Rembrandt, but nobody knows which painting that it is because nobody has seen it. All are, you can create different sort of views, historical views of the things that you know now, but also the things that you could know in the past. So we have different sort of storylines and views on those storylines, either cuts in time or slices, which are in more transversal views, so that we can bring different time slots together in so-called kaleidoscope views, which is also a term used by Latour and by Weyer and by other historians to get a grip on different sort of time schedules. Another thing that we did was the second one, ontology for archival resources. So we made a distinction between an observation, that is, for instance, when someone is mentioned in a document, but also you can make reconstructions, which can be, for instance, inversed information, inferred information. For instance, if you do not have a baptismal record of someone who is born, but you know of a not born certificate, but you do have a baptismal record, then at least you know that the person has been born. So you can then also know that there is a time interval, for instance, of for instance, a couple of weeks that this person has been baptized, and you can then have an estimate of when this person has been born. These are kind of what we call inferred observations. We then, from multiple documents, can make reconstructions of particular persons, and then link that with the original sources, because that is very important. That if you make reconstructions, that you always have the provenance where the information is coming from. So I'll give you an example. Here, for instance, you see all sorts of lines sitting in documents where we then modeled ontologies, which we can directly link in the visualizations to particular lines in the original documents of the archival resources of the Notary Acts of Amsterdam. Of course, we also wanted to model the uncertainty. As I said, we have a lot of uncertainty when you're dealing with archival resources. We had sometimes information which sit in the documents itself. So that is then easy. But as I said, sometimes we combined information, we inferred information. That also has its implications for the provenance. So we tried to make a typology, first of all, of documents itself, of where you could see directly the content when you observed it, but also when you did indirect interpretations. And then we still wanted to know whether you want to have very detailed provenance, because, or whether you just want to have very global provenance, which can sometimes be sufficient if you're connecting something in a coded archival description, for instance. But sometimes you want to have very detailed provenance. So we made this matrix as a way to get a grip of uncertainty in the modeling of our ontologies. And finally, the third ontology that we developed, Vruska, Zamolini, and I, had to deal with the concept of time. In the semantic web, there are already attempts to create ontologies, for instance, in CDOC CRM, or you have Periodo, but they're still very often based on calendar time, and they are not really dealing with the historical conceptualizations of durations, for instance. And that's what we thought, okay, we, as historians, we have a long tradition in working with time. So why don't we use that knowledge to create our own ontologies of time and see how we can bring that together. To that end, we were used in particular the information of, George Coupler, The Shape of Time, who has very strong views about how to use visual resources as a way of periodization. For instance, he has the idea that that style, for instance, is not relevant for periodization because it's always in flux. It's too ephemeral, so it's not a good way of modeling time in his view. But also he was convinced that iconology, for instance, was not useful because they are basically interested in the continuities of art historical themes. And then for that reason, they are not concerned with the concept of time. So he came up with a different way of modeling time, which we used for our own model. So first of all, for him, it's important that in the making of a work of art as an historical process, it's not just about the object, but also about all the ideas that you're having in anticipation in the making of that particular object. So that's something that we modeled. As I said, he was also not interested in calendar time, but he was far more interested in the way you could look at, for instance, different solutions over time and try to model that. So what kind of solution was made in a technical way, for instance, the Gothic cathedral or chiaroscuro in painting? What kind of solutions did they make and how were those developments over time? So it's far more experience-based rather than on periods, style periods. So it's also more based on the careers of particular artists, or about the artist and their pupils, or the artist and their family. So it's what he calls addiction time. There are a couple of time slots which say more about generations of artists rather than particular style periods. So we took that as a departure for our models. You have, for instance, the way we modeled the idea of chiaroscuro. And then you can see that it is considered as a kind of solution over time, which begins with Caravaggio, but then, for instance, it's picked up in France with Latour, And it ends, for instance, with the film of Stanley Kubrick, where he also used chiaroscuro, but then as part of a movie. Yes, and that's the way Cooper was looking at this, and that's what we try to model in this ontological frameworks. As I said, he used this kind of definitions of biographical patterns, of generations of artists, and once again, this kind of time slots is what we took as point of departure for our own project. So this is more or less the way how we handled heritage in a digital environment. And now I want to say a few things about how we are dealing with heritage of the digital. So the second part of the theme of the seminar. Caroline already told me that, I would say something about data for history. Caroline contacted Data for History Consortium a couple of months ago to say something about the project. I myself am one of the many founding partners of this particular consortium. What it does, it's a kind of data management system of ontologies. So as you can see, we created in our project 3 different ontologies for historical research, for the Golden Ages project, for archival research, and for time. And there are many projects involved in this project of data for history, all the creating ontologies mainly for history, but also with the idea in mind that we can combine it with CDOC CRM. We found that brought us together. CDOC CRM was perhaps sometimes too limited for describing historical processes. Of course, it started in the context of cultural heritage, and there's a very strong focus on the object. But as an historian, you want to describe processes, the making of things, and the impact of things over time. And there we sometimes felt the need to create additional ontologies. And those ontologies are managed in that system of data for history and stored in what is called onto-me for reuse. And we created, for instance, a subgroup for the creation of ontologies for storylines, and that is then sits in that particular environment. And second way of dealing with digital, with the heritage of the digital, in the Netherlands we have met in many countries, but in the Netherlands we have a large infrastructure for the humanities called CLARIA. That stands for Common Lab Research Infrastructure for the Arts and the Humanities. So it is in combination of what you sometimes hear of Clarin and Daria. We brought that together in Claria. So bringing together history and the literary studies. And we found it important when we were developing our project and all the standards that we did it together with the national infrastructure so that it can be reused in other projects as well. And finally, you also have for the individual projects in the Netherlands, you have a separate service. It's called tant, Data Archiving and Network Services. So if you get a subsidy of the Dutch funding organization, then you are obliged to store your data as an individual research project in the repository of tant so that the data can be reused by other researchers. Apart from GitHub and everything what you do, you need to store it in tant. And for the large infrastructure project, like the Golden Ages project, then you want to store it in Claria so that it can be continued in the future. And the first and last step that I would like to mention, and I think that's the best solution for the heritage of the digital, and I would call that a more active heritage, and that is that while you have the funding for the building of a large infrastructure project, that halfway the project, you already start to find new partners for the use of your own infrastructure. That allows people who want to write a new grant for funding. That is to say, we are already building on an investment of your institution, and we are already working together, and we already have the data, but at the same time, we want to do something different. There's a huge advantage. During the project, the Golden Age, the Golden Agents, the term Golden Age became more and more contested also because the role of the city of Amsterdam, but also of Rotterdam and Utrecht in slavery. And very often the work of arts were robbed or financed by slavery. So there were a lot of municipal reports of the cities, but also now of the king of the Netherlands, who want to know where the objects are coming from. So that means that you just can't use anymore even the term Dutch Golden Age. But the advantages is that we did a lot of work of all the people who were involved, the productions, but also the consumers of the works of arts. So for instance, 10% of the income of Amsterdam was based on Atlantic slavery, and 50% of the burgomasters of Amsterdam had a role in the East Indian Company of the Netherlands, 50%. We know who those people are. We can even do name and shame of those people. That, of course, is not very recent, not very serious research, naming and shaming, but we're already looking and working together with new projects. For instance, like a recently funded project, the Female Impact, and this is about the role of women in the production and consumption of artworks of the Dutch Golden Age. So we have already a lot of information. They have new research questions that can use our data and our tools to make analysis. And the same applies to the project which is currently running, Freedom of the Streets, which is about the use of the street by women in the Dutch Golden Age, but also in Kyoto. It's a kind of comparative research. So these are just two examples of how you halfway your project can create new projects using the infrastructures that you have built, which in my view is the best way of dealing with heritage of the digital. So to conclude, digital for the heritage, important that cultural heritage and research institutions work together in the modeling and linking from data. Since you are working with a lot of heterogeneous data, it's very important to keep track of provenance, that you create tools to keep track of provenance. And finally, if you want to involve your users, it's very important that you give them the tools to interact with the data, and that you don't leave it just in the hands of the people who are writing algorithms, etc., but that they can do it themselves. Heritage of the digitals, it's important, first of all, that you can exchange your expertise of ontologies and data, for instance, in the Data for History Consortium, and put them into the database of Ontomy. But it is also important, if there is a national infrastructure, if you start up a project already, to start talking with them to see how you can work together. And finally, as I said, halfway your project, try to talk with new partners so that you're sure that your infrastructure will be reused. It's good for them, the new applicants, that they can say we are already working together. And for you yourself finishing the project, you can already put in your report that there is already continuation, and that's always very important for funding organizations, that they know that their investments are reused. Thank you very much. Here's some extra information for if you want to have links. But as I said, I've already sent the PDF to Caroline, and so there can already make use of this presentation if you're interested to play a little bit with the links that I have incorporated.
So thank you very much, Charles. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Do we have some questions?
Just one.
Can you hear Christophe in
the...
I can hear Christophe. Yeah, yes, indeed.
Yes,
yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. It's very, very interesting. Just a very short question. Which environment do you use for building your ontologies?
Well, that's a very nitty-gritty question. It has been developed in the UFO, in the fundamental ontologies. They have been working together with Varushka Zambolini, and so it is mainly in that, and we align it with accessing mainly with CDOC-CRM. So we made our own ontologies, but we wanted to be sure that there were mappings possible to CDOC-CRM. So we have looked mainly to CDOC-CRM, but also in some cases we have developed our own ontologies. And of course, we have also looked into some of the examples which were in the OntoMe, but mainly it's constructed, in particular the storylines one is mainly constructed by Varushka Zambolini. If
Okay.
that's a question, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Is your method adaptable to other fields? For example, here we have a lot of fields from history of scientific and technical objects. You are focused on art.
Yeah.
Do you think it is adaptable?
Like every ontology, there will be classes that could be connected, and same time there are very specific classes. So if you're referring to scientific instruments, for instance, then you need additional ontologies. For instance, I don't know whether you're familiar with it, but it's the Tools of Knowledge project in Cambridge University at the moment, which is currently running. And that would be a very interesting extension if you really want to would capture scientific instruments, for instance, into ontologies. So yeah, like everything in the semantic web, some classes can be aligned and we can map to each other, but some are so specific that they wouldn't tally with the data sets that we have been using. Of course, we didn't use all the collections of the Rijksmuseum, and we didn't use, and also of all the participating institutions, and that also implies that although the Rijksmuseum also has scientific instruments, for instance, that it doesn't sit necessarily into the ontology.
Another question. What didn't you use OWL time? It wasn't suitable for your system?
What we didn't use, we didn't want to just to use calendar time, for instance, because so for that reason, but it was, I must say that the time element was more a thought experiment, because we wanted to see, we were really not satisfied with existing ontologies of time, and as I said, we were interested in historical interactions. We were interested in historical processes. And then we realized that existing ontologies of time in OWL or in Periodo were just not sufficient. So, and that's thought, okay, let's see what we can do. And that for that reason, we created that, but we didn't implement it. We didn't implement the time model. So the time model is still very much based on that, what sits in CDOC-CRM and in Periodo. But it was a thought experiment to see what we could do with informations of historians like George Kuplo.
Are there any questions? No. So thank you very much, Charles.
You're welcome.
I
Thank
think for our own project, we will have to contact you in a few years.
Yes, I said, yeah, well, I sent the link and please play with it. I mean, the funding is finished now, so you have now to look at other projects. And I'm retired, but no, but I think if you just try to see what you whether you like it, and you can always ask me questions, and I can always refer you to the right people. I mean, there were about 20, 25 people involved in this project, and they all have their own expertises. So depending on the question, I would just refer you to the right person. I just can give a very general overview, but of course I don't have the expertise myself of all those specific aspects of such a large infrastructure. This is real teamwork.
Okay, thank you. And I invite you to participate next year, I think, to TOT, because it should be very interesting to have this sort of presentation, I think, Christopher. I hope you agree.
Okay, thank you very much.